hey, the real premise behind this series, or the tagline, if you were to fill in the blank with what the series is all about, it's real simple. It's how to spend your life and not waste it. How to spend your life and not waste it. How to spend your life and not waste it. Or how to spend your life intentionally and not waste it unintentionally. And honestly, that statement in and of itself might be a little bit offensive, because the implication is you have a tendency, and I have a tendency, to unintentionally waste our life. And no one sits back necessarily in time and says, man, I'm just wasting my life right now. That's not necessarily a common thought, but here's what happens often. People look back 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now, some people perhaps on their deathbed, and they just have tremendous regrets about things that were wasted. Time that was wasted. Opportunity that was wasted. Money that was wasted. Relationships that were wasted. And anyone probably at this point in life, regardless of how old you are, you can look back at a season, a month, a semester, a time period in your life, and you can look back at one or more areas and think, man, there was a lot wasted. And so what we're doing is we're just going through these major kind of meta categories of life, saying, don't waste. Don't waste. Don't waste. Your time is important. Your money is important. And your potentials and your abilities and your gifting is important. So don't waste life, because we don't want anybody to look back 20 years from now or 30 years from now or 40 years from now and say, man, I wasted so much, fill in the blank with whatever it is. Now, last week, Pastor Adrian came and he talked about time. He just did a phenomenal job. I just want to give a round of applause for him, man. He just did a tremendous job. How many of you guys were here last week? Kind of give like a little round of applause. A couple of you are raising your hand. Okay, that was a little bit of a confusing setup by me, so that's my fault. And according to the hand raising, we got about a 5% rate of return at our church. So we'll see none of you next week. So Adrian talked about it, and it was just a tremendous insight into time to basically say, hey, you're going to spend your time places, and to make the most use of your time, you have to spend it intentionally being present. Be present in the moment, that Jesus was always present in the moment. Now today, we're going to talk about a subject that I have been looking forward to talking about for weeks and weeks, in fact, months at this point. People in our content team can tell you. And we're going to talk about something that when I say it, and I say the subject, many of you are going to wish that you weren't here this week and that you came next week. Some of you are going to, you brought a friend for the first time. You're like, oh gosh, this is the worst possible subject to invite my friend that's here for the first time. But let me just kind of make a couple promises after I tell you the subject. Here's what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about money. We're going to talk about money. Now, when I say that, there's just a super nervous, oh my gosh, So at the end of the service, let me just tell you how this is going to end. We're going to do another offering, and we're just going to sing 35 verses as Come As You Are, and you're going to give your entire bank account, all right? So let me just confirm all your fears. That's what's going to happen. Just kidding. Here's a couple promises I want to make you. Number one, I'm going to give you some homework, and only about 10% of you, maybe, that'd be like a good percentage, only about 10% of you are actually going to do what I ask you to do. And I get that. That happens pretty much every week. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, that was so incredible. All right, let's go to Sonny's, and you just kind of forget everything. So you don't have to feel bad about that. But about 10% of you are going to actually implement what we're going to talk about. And those that do, let me just make you a promise. You will, with the money that you have, you will save more, you will have less debt, and you will be more satisfied with what you have. Let me just promise you. If you do what we do and what we're going to talk about today, because the Bible does talk about money a lot, and many of us, when we think about money, when it talks about the Bible, you think, how much do I got to give? I mean, come on, God's going to ask me to give everything. But more than he talks about giving, or as much as God talks about giving, he talks more probably about how to manage what you have, how to use what you have, and how to leverage what you have for the kingdom of God. And as we talk today, you're going to probably, if you take this advice, if you're going to do the stuff that we're going to tell you to do, and we're going to give you some very specific homework, you're going to have more in your savings account, you're going to be a happier person, and you're going to have less debt. But again, only a handful of you are actually going to take it and implement it. So that being said, let me just kind of kick off the discussion with some observations about money that you probably know. All of us in here make money, all right? To some degree, well, hopefully you do. If you don't, get a job. But, your parents make money and they give it to you. But here's the reality. For all of us, we're rich. Whether you want to admit it or not, whether you feel rich is very difficult to see in the mirror. Very few of us actually feel rich, but all of us know rich people, It's like, I'm not rich, but I know a guy who's rich, because rich always looks richer when somebody else has more money than we do. But here's the reality. All of us in here are rich. In fact, for many of you, you're in college and you have these ideas of how much you're going to make. Let me just kind of give you some percentages. If this year you were to make $40,000. Many of you are studying for jobs that you're going to make way more than that. But if you make 40 grand this year, you are in the top 0.5% of the top percent of wage earners in the entire world. That means you are in the 99.5 percentile of all income earners in the entire world because you are rich, whether you feel like it or not. In fact, if you were to make $80,000, and again, many of you, some of us, we look at that and we're like, I'll never make that. But some of you are like a doctors. You're like, I would throw $80,000 on my couch right now because I'm just, I'm loaded. And so, hey, you should give online. Anyways, for those of you, you're just going to make tons and tons of money. Here's what's interesting. If you make $80,000, you are in the top 0.10% of the top percent of all the income earners in the world. Now, I don't know that maybe you guys don't do this, but I'm going to pull up my iPhone to prove that I'm rich. So there's this website called globalrichlist.com. So let me just tell you a couple things about you if you make $80,000 this year. You're in the top 0.10%. That makes you the 6,253,513th richest person on earth by income. So congratulations. In a place of about 6 or 7 billion people, you're in the top 0.10. In 1 hour, you make $41.67. Now, for those of you who work at Chick-fil-A and you make like $9.50, you should be pissed right now. Here's the one that's interesting. You earn $80,000 in 1 year. It would take the average laborer in Zimbabwe 78 years to earn the amount that you're going to make this year, which means a person in Zimbabwe is going to work 40 hours a week, 52 weeks a year, no time off, no vacation, and they're not going to make as much as you make until 2093. And here's why. Because you're rich, and I'm rich. For many of us, because of the country that we live in, because of the families that we were born into, because the education that we were pushed to put a premium on, you're rich, and I'm rich. And we're all rich, but none of us feel rich because all of us know someone else who is rich. But by the world standards, by international standards, you are all rich people. So congratulations. You made it in life. You're rich. But here's what's interesting about being rich. For most people, none of us feel rich because we don't have any margin in our life. We don't have any margin. We pretty much spend, we make what we spend. In fact, if you're like the average American, you spend about 8% above what you actually make, every single year. And that's kind of a rich people problem. In fact, here's what's really interesting about rich people. And this is just, it's crazy to think about, but it makes so much sense. Most of us spend our lives either getting ready to or in the process of making money. That means that most of us spend our lives doing some type of an education, going to college, going to grad school, doing your undergrad, getting your AA. Perhaps you're in high school and you're doing your high school, but you're looking because someday you're going to make money. And then at some point you start making money. Maybe at first it's kind of like a part-time hourly job. Someday it's going to be a salary job. But most of us spend the majority of our daytime hours making money, but very few of us know where our money goes to. You ever think about that? Isn't that crazy? You spend your entire life going for something that you have no clue where it goes. That's ridiculous. That's a rich people problem. And here's why. Because we have so much. We don't even know where it all goes. We have so much. We couldn't even tell you. We have some guesses, and we got some bills, and we've got some, cell phone stuff. If you're an adult in here, maybe you got a mortgage, and you pay your mortgage. If you're not, you're... This always cracks me up. Maybe you're a college student and you guys split cable bill, and so your part of the cable is like $33. And you're like, oh my gosh, that's so expensive, And then one person orders a movie and all of a sudden your portion is $35. And you're like, bro, you owe me $2. It's like you're like the top 1% of age, income earners in the world. Are you kidding me? It's like $2. Some of you, I've seen people get in physical altercation over milk. One dude chugged another dude's milk, and it's like, bro, that was my milk, If you're super bro, then somebody stole your protein powder, you're like, bro, that's, gains. How am I going to get my gains without my protein powder? And so, I'm serious. People rich people who have no clue where the rest of their money goes, get in physical altercations because one dude stole another dude's milk or because someone ordered an extra thing on Comcast Xfinity, and no one likes Comcast. They are the devil. Don't ever call them. But we all hate them. But it's a rich people problem. We don't know where our stuff goes that we spend our entire lives going for. And here's what's interesting about this whole thing. you and I never really feel rich because, let me just tell you why. We have an assumption, and here's our assumption. I call it the income assumption. The more I make, the happier I'm going to be. The more I make, the happier I'm going to be. And what's interesting is Solomon, way back in the Old Testament, many of you, again, a couple weeks ago, we talked about this guy named King David. And King David was one of the greatest, if not the greatest king in the entire nation of Israel. But he had a son named Solomon. And Solomon led the nation of Israel when they were at the peak, the absolute apex of their military and their economic power. And Solomon had the most money personally in the entire world. And on top of that, Solomon was an incredibly wise guy, because one guy, not like a wise guy like, your sense of humor. One day, God came to him with a dream. Solomon had just taken over the kingdom. He was a young fellow when he was, took over the kingdom. So God came to him with a dream. And God said, Solomon, you can have anything you want. Anything, just ask it, do you want military power? Do you want political power? Do you want land? Do you want wealth? Solomon, anything you want, it's yours. You just ask. Solomon says, well, the one thing I want is wisdom, that I may govern wisely. God sees that. And says, because you could have asked for anything, but you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you everything. And Solomon was so wise that kings and nations and leaders from all over the place would travel miles and miles and miles and miles to come hear Solomon talk. And Solomon would write stuff down, and people would read, and people would just, bask in Solomon's wisdom. Because Solomon was both the wisest and the richest man on earth. And in one of these documents called Ecclesiastes was preserved through antiquity. And in Ecclesiastes 5, we're going to read some stuff that Solomon says about income and what you feel and what I feel. And here's the cool thing. About 2/3 of the way through it, we're all going to feel like bad people. But at the end, Solomon's going to give something that I think is so insightful. It creates an entirely new category for how you and I ought to live in light of the fact that, like it or not, we're rich people. So, if you got your Bible, you can open up to Ecclesiastes chapter 5. Ecclesiastes chapter 5. He's also the guy who wrote Proverbs. But if you're like me and you don't like Proverbs, which is a weird thing to say as a pastor, but it's just like, man, I like this conscious stream of thought, not like this and that. Oh, there's a bird. If you ever read Proverbs, you know what I'm talking about. Ecclesiastes, it's a little bit better, but it's just very depressing. He basically says, hey, everything's worthless. And anyways, you should read it for yourself. So in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, Solomon's going through this whole thing of basically saying, hey, I'm a rich guy, I'm, powerful, I've got the most money in the world, I've got the most power in the world, in fact, I'm the wisest guy in the world, and so with all my riches and all my wisdom, there's some things that I have observed that people thought were going to make them happy, but it's just not happiness. It's just not happiness. And people thought, and they thought, if I can acquire, it's just not going to make you happy. So this is what he says in chapter 5, verse 10. He says this, he who loves money will never be satisfied with money, nor he who loves wealth with his income. This also is vanity. So Solomon starts out and says, let me just give you an observation from a rich guy, from a guy who has tons of wisdom, in fact, the wisest man on the earth at the time, the wisest man who had ever been on the earth at that time. From a rich, wise guy, let me just tell you, the more you make does not make you more satisfied. The more you make does not make you more satisfied. In fact, we kind of have a graph, because I just wanted this to be crystal clear for all you math people. So let's get that little thing up there. All right, so this is high for those of you non-math people. I try to make this super easy. All right, so there's an X and a Y axis. All right, so here's where we're going to go. Income, $20,000, $40,000, $60,000, $80,000. Now, here's what our assumption is. The more I make, the happier I'm going to be. So we're like, okay, at this point, I'm eating ramen, But at this point, I'm eating Chick-fil-A, right? And at this point, I'm buying cars. And at this point, it's about like jet ski life. You buy a boat type of thing. Somewhere along this point, you buy like a beach house maybe, Over here is a Bugatti, hopefully. You kind of go along. And here's our assumption. That the more you make, the happier you're going to be. And Solomon says, let me just tell you from a rich guy's perspective. Let me tell you from a wise guy's perspective. The more you make doesn't make you happier. The more you make doesn't make you happier. In fact, this is kind of what Solomon's saying. The more you make, you're about the same amount of happy. And here's what studies have shown, and you can research this on your own. Essentially, once you have enough money to pay your bills, there is a dramatic reduction in how much more you make to how much happier it makes you. Once you have enough to cover your bills, to cover your basic living expenses, the more you make does not make you happier. And here's what's genius about Solomon. The next verse, because this is kind of counterintuitive. All of us think, because we've seen somebody with a boat, we've seen somebody with a jet ski, we've seen somebody with a nicer car than we have, or nicer clothes than we have, and they always look happier, and they always look better, and they always look nicer. So we think they're happier than we are. But here's what Solomon says. Now, this is so intuitive. Verse 12. Or verse 11. 12. 11. He says, when goods increase, they increase who eat them. When goods increase, they increase who eat them. And what advantage has their owner but to see them with his eyes? Now, here's what's incredible what Solomon says. Solomon says, as your income increases, you think your happiness is going to increase. But here's why your happiness doesn't increase as your income increases. Because as your happiness increases, or as your income increases, your appetite increases. And here's what you've experienced. In fact, this is pretty intuitive. You used to make, if you're hourly in here, and you make a strong $9 an hour, and then you got a raise to $9.50, and you're like, I'm banking. You're going to the, I was going to say club. We'll say Chuck E. Cheese because it's a church. You're going somewhere, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I've got so much money. And then as you made more, you got to the end of the month, and you didn't have more in your account. And here's why. For some of you, again, you have, you used to make this much, you got a 10% raise, you got a 20% raise, maybe you got a 25% raise, and you thought, oh my gosh, finally I've got the margin, finally I can save, finally I can give, finally I can do the things, I can buy the things, and you got to the end of the month, and you didn't have any more money in your account. And here's why, we've all experienced it. As your income grows, your appetite grows. As your income grows, your appetite grows, and as your appetite grows, your level of satisfaction with what you have does not grow. This is why when you started out, you were fine eating out once every 2 weeks, but as you made more money, it became the norm to eat out 3 times a week. And it's not a big deal, and you spend more money. You don't really think about it, but here's what happened. Your appetite grew. And I'm not pointing fingers. This happens to everybody. You used to be able to be fine driving this car, then you made more money, and you got to drive this car because it's safer, right? I don't know if you've ever, just kind of put us all on the same page here. So my wife and I, when we first got married and I started the church and I wasn't making anything, and she was in her first job, she wasn't making anything, and so we were kind of both in this stage of life, and you've been in the stage of life where you buy the rotisserie chicken from Publix, and you get about 3 meals out of it. So the first one you actually eat chicken, and then the second meal you just kind of tear the chicken apart and you put it in some rice, and you kind of try to fill yourself up on rice with like a little bit of chicken and some spices in it, some Lowry seasoning salt. Hello, that's God's gift to the earth for poor people. And then on the third day when Jesus rose again, you made broth. You just got the chicken bones and put it all in a thing, and you basically drank chicken water over some more rice, and you thought, that's wonderful, and that's what happens. And then you start making more money, and you get a raise, and you drive this car, and you drive that car, and then, for us, as we start making more money, and I took a different job, and she took a different job, and we start making more, and then we're about to have a kid, and we think, gosh, well, we've got an extended cab F-150. We need to try that. We need to get a family-friendly vehicle. And you've maybe had this conversation if you're a little bit older. You start looking at SUVs because, who wants to drive a van? Although if you're a van driver in here, you love vans. People who are van drivers are like cultic about vans. But so we're looking at SUVs, and at first, you start off with something modest. It's like, we need to drive an Explorer, you know what I mean? Something that's not even that modest. That's just, decent. And so then we're looking at it. We're sitting there saying, just because, we have one kid, we might have 2 kids, and we've got a dog and stuff like that, and so we just need a blacked out 2009 Suburban. We just, and let me just be honest about how the conversation went in our house for a while. It's like, I don't know if a Suburban's enough, I think we might need an Excursion. I know they're like a school bus on steroids, I know that they can go over other cars and stuff like that, but come on, baby. we got to keep the kiddos safe, you know? It's not even that I want more. It's not appetite haven't even grown. Are you kidding me? No, I'm just in the name of safety because I care about you and I care about Ava. I mean, we just got to have an excursion. And then we realized, well, that's ridiculous. We're going to get a Suburban instead for the 3 people in our family. And we have a row for every person in our family in one of the multiple cars that we have in our family. So, that, you know, and here's why I say that. As your income grows, your appetite grows. As your income grows, your appetite grows. And then Solomon says something very, very, very insightful, which is counterintuitive to what we would normally think as it relates to income. Because this stuff you can kind of put together and we think, but this takes a rich guy who's seen a lot of rich people. And he says, let me tell you something that I've observed about people who have money or who will have money. He says this. Sweet is the sleep, verse 12. Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much. But the full stomach of the rich will not let him sleep. Now here's what's just so insightful. Psalm says, let me just tell you something that I've seen. And you might not have seen this, maybe you've seen this. Usually, people with more money also have more stress. Usually people with more money also worry more. In fact, let me just pull up a really obvious graph for you. Usually as your income grows, your stress grows. Once you can pay your bills, and obviously if you're at a point where you can't even pay your bills, and you know, if you budgeted perfectly and stewarded perfectly and you still didn't have enough, that's a different story. But once you have enough, as your income grows, your stress grows. And here's why. Because as your appetite grows, your concern for losing what satisfies your appetite grows. As you amass more and as you accumulate more, you have more to lose. You have a bigger appetite to lose. You have more wealth to lose. And so Solomon says, hey, I'm just telling you, this is a rich people problem. But let me tell you what I've seen with rich people. A lot of the poor people, just labor, you know, just making ends meet, getting from paycheck to paycheck, and you're making it. There's a lot less stress because they got less to lose. But with the people that have a lot, let me just tell you, I've seen. There's a lot of worry. There's a lot of sleepless nights. Any of you, especially who are business owners, who are small business owners, which is one of the predominant ways that people get rich in America today. Our investment advisor sat down with us and said the basic 2 ways that people get rich in America today. People don't necessarily get rich off the stock market. They don't go from nothing to incredible. I mean, it happens from time to time. But the vast majority are off real estate and buying and selling businesses. And if I had a nickel for every time small business owners lost sleep because of the stress of owning a company that they might lose, we'd have a new church building. Because the reality is, the more you make, the more stressed you are. The more you make, the more stressed you are. So Solomon kind of says, let me just throw a little something on the fire here. He says, there's a grievous evil that I have seen under the sun, that riches were kept by their owner to his hurt. In other words, he had all this money into it, and it started to actually have a negative consequence, and those riches were lost in a bad venture. And he is a father of a son, but he has nothing in his hand. And as he came from his mother's womb, so shall he go again. Naked as he came, and shall take nothing for his toil that he may carry away in his hand. And this also is a grievous evil. Just as he came, so shall he go. And what gain is there to him who toils for the wind? Moreover, all his days he eats in darkness, in much vexation, and sickness, and anger. Paul says, let me just again tell you another little stressor about having money. The worst thing is when you had it, and you worried about it, and then you lost it. Because you remember what you have, and your appetite is still for what you used to have. Because we all have the income assumption that to make more is going to make us happier. Now at this point, most of us, just to be honest, it's a little bit condemning. Because for many of us, again, we're rich people. And so we think, okay, great, this is the point in the service where you say, okay, sell everything, give it all away, who cares about money? And that's not at all what Solomon says. Because again, when most of us think about money in church, we think it's either health and wealth or we think it's just complete poverty. We think it's either, sell everything, don't have anything material is evil, or God, give me, bless me. And Solomon, in this next couple verses, says something that he's observed that creates a third category for people who have money. In other words, Solomon kind of looks at this whole thing, having an incredible amount of wisdom, having an incredible amount of money, and says, there's some things that I've seen about some rich people who get it right. There's some bad that I've seen. There's some negative that I've seen. In fact, I've seen some incredible stories of hurt and heartache of people who had and lost everything and didn't have anything to give to the next generation. But there's some people that I've seen that handled it really wisely. And so let me tell you a third category, which maybe you didn't think about before. He says, behold, what I've seen to be good, what I've seen to be positive. So again, I've seen a lot. Let me tell you a good thing. In fitting, what I've seen to be good and fitting is to eat, drink, and find enjoyment. And all the toil, and when it says toil, you can kind of put the word work in there. With which one works under the sun the few days of his life that God has given him. In other words, he pauses and says, let me just tell you a positive thing that I've seen in rich people. There's some rich people that they realize this, that what they have, God has given to them. And God has given them to manage and to steward, but also to enjoy. That God has given to manage and to steward, and also to enjoy. In other words, Solomon says, hey, God's given you this, and some of what God's given you is to enjoy it. But I want you to realize that God has given it. Now, this may seem super obvious to us, but this changes the game with how we look at money. Because most of the stuff that I have in my life is not directly related to what I've done. Or some of it is directly related to what I've done, but there are so many variables that I cannot control that just are what they are, and I am who I am, and I am where I am because of what God did. Let me just give you an example. I have absolutely no control over the fact that I was born in the richest country in the world. No control over that. I have absolutely no control over the fact that I was born into a family who put a precedent on education, and I didn't even do well in education. But my family demanded it so much that I went to TCC. In fact, let me just tell you a little bit about me. I was so bad in school, I didn't even take the SAT. You know why? You don't have to take it to get to TCC. Why am I going to waste a Saturday? What'd you get on the ACT? No clue. You get 1,600. I don't know. SAT, 16. I got a perfect score. I got a 0. I didn't get anything because I was a bad student. But you know what? I was born into a family that said, you're going to college, you're going to college, you're going to college. And in fact, before you get to college, we're going to pay for your college so that when you get to college, you don't even have to pay for it. My parents didn't think I was going to graduate high school, to be honest. That's not like a self-effacing thing. That's like a honest, when I graduated college, I think my parents cried, not because we're so proud of you. They're like, we didn't think it was going to happen, Spent a couple years at TCC, spent a lot more years at Florida State, and I was here for I got my time in, I was like a veteran in the student section by the time. I think I had my plaque on one of those risers because they were like, oh yeah, Ben's coming back for another, super senior, super year. Well, let me just tell you. I had no control over the fact that I was born into a family who put such a precedent on education. I had no control over the fact that I was put in such a family that if I made bad choices in life, they could find ways for me to get out of bad choices in life. I had no control over the fact that I was born into a family that we never had to worry about paying our light bill or if we were going to eat. It was just where do you want to eat? When I was growing up, many of you did this, you went to the mall when you were in 6th, 7th, 8th grade because it was the cool thing. And by cool, I mean you went around and did nothing and just did drugs and stuff like that. But that's a whole other sermon for a whole other day. And my dad, every time I'd go to the mall, every Friday night, Dad, where going to the mall? Who's going to the mall? We didn't text people. We would have texted people. You call everybody on their landline. Ba-ding, ba-ding, Hey, man, where you going? We're going to the mall. Okay, cool, I'm going to the mall too. And every Friday, every Saturday, we go to the mall. $20. $20. My dad used to call me a 20 magnet. Many of you, your parents in here, you maybe with your kid, now that they're in college, right? They're 100 magnets. They get real expensive real quick. And I had no control over that. no control over the country, no control over the education, no control over all the different variables that could have happened to me, that I could have been born in Zimbabwe as an average laborer making 8 cents an hour. But I was born in an American upper middle class family that lived in the suburbs in Tallahassee, Florida, who never had to worry about bills. And Solomon says, here's what you got to realize. You have been given, you have been entrusted with, and you are allowed to enjoy. But like David said a couple weeks ago, God, everything I have, everything I've given back to you is simply yours. That God, everything is yours, and you have entrusted me with some of it while I'm here and working on the earth. Let me say this. You should never feel bad about having money. You should always feel responsible. You should never feel bad about being rich. You should always feel responsible. You should never feel bad about making a big income. You should always feel responsible. Because bad says mine, responsible says yours. That's like, so for Lindsay and I, we've got guys that we meet with that handle all of our insurance, and they handle all of our investments, and they handle all of our accounts, and make sure we're staying on the course and staying on track. When we started working with them, and monthly as we kind of transfer money over into investment accounts and stuff like that, they never say, Ben, we just feel so bad because you're giving us money. Well, first off, they wouldn't because we don't give them that much, but, they never say, oh my gosh, we feel terrible. They're responsible for what I've given them. They're responsible for how they invest it. They're responsible for how they steward and how they manage the things that I have entrusted them with. They don't feel bad because it's not theirs to feel bad about. And in the same way, with the things that we have, Solomon says, let me just tell you, God's given you some of it to enjoy. Absolutely. You shouldn't feel bad about it. But you should feel that God has given that to you, and that should drive a feeling of responsibility with what you have. In fact, he finishes by saying this. He says, everyone also to whom God has given wealth and possessions and power to enjoy them and to accept his lot and rejoice in toil, that this is the gift, or this is the gift of God. In other words, you've been given the ability to enjoy. You've been given the ability to steward. And you've been given the responsibility. So you should never, ever, 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 ever feel bad. But you should always, 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 always feel responsible for what you've been entrusted with. So let me give you a few application points. And this is the homework that, again, only a couple of you are going to do, but, not all of you are. But if you do, I'm just telling you. Take this advice. You're going to have more in savings. You're going to be happier with what you have in savings. And you're going to have less debt in your life. When we first sat down, and if you guys have ever done this, you sat down with somebody. In fact, for many of you, you're in your college right now, and so at some point in life, you're going to graduate college, and every dude that you've ever known who's ever been in a fraternity is going to call you from some random, I work for this company or that company. Come here, I want to sit down and talk with you. It's like, I haven't heard from you in 5 years. And they're going to want to sit down and talk for you, and they're going to want to plan out your financial future, and that's fine. It's a great way to earn a living. And they're going to sit down, and here's what they say. What's your goal? What's your goal? What do you want to retire with? How much do you want to give? How much do you want to save? What percentage of your income do you think you need to do to get to your goal? And they'll talk about how investments, and they'll talk about compounding interest, and they'll talk about, all this kind of different stuff that happens in life. But it starts with, what's your goal? And then at some point, you get to make a framework for how your monthly and how your weekly and how your daily budget goes. If you're going to spend that much, if you're going to save that much, if you're going to give that much, then you ought to know where the stuff that you have is going. And so you create a personal budget, but you can't create a personal budget until you know where the stuff that you currently have is going. So let me give you a couple nuts and bolts. We created a really high-level financial worksheet for you guys. You're going to get this when you walk out of the door, by the way. As you can tell, super intricate for all you finance people in here. CPAs, I know, you're just like, oh my gosh, work for our company. We'll get to that later. Start off, real difficult, a giving goal. You ought to have a goal, how much you want to give. You ought to have a goal percentage-wise, how much you want to give. Savings goal. You ought to have a goal for how much you want to save. And let me tell you why I put it at the top. Because if you decide to give and to save after you've spent, you're going to have nothing left. You ought to have a giving goal, and you ought to have a savings goal in your life. You ought to have personal financial goals. And again, here's why. As anybody who stewards or is responsible for what someone has given them, they have to be in tune with the goals of the giver. Now, I don't say that to say, hey, you have to give 10%. You have to give 50%. You have to give 100%, online, downtownfuture.com. No. Here's the point. Here's the point. For many of us, and this is serious, the average American makes 100% and spends about 105 to 108%. The average American makes 100% and spends somewhere between 105 and 108%. So for you to decide, I'm going to give 10% away, it's just not reasonable right now because you don't even have the margin to break even. But I want you to set a goal for how much you want to save every month. And I want you to have a goal for how much you want to give every month. And just, ease a little tension. You don't even have to give it to us. If you're in here and you're not sure if you're not a Christian or you're investigating this whole church thing or this faith thing again, let me just tell you, there is study after study after study after study that links happiness to generosity. Happiness to generosity. You don't have to be a Christian in here to believe this. You don't ever have to give to this church. Go give to the United Way. They have tons of incredible organizations. Go give to Echo. Go give to the Phi Center. I mean, there's tons of incredible organizations that happen here around town and happen globally. But you ought to have a giving goal. And you ought to have a savings goal. And then, I want you to, for 1 week, track all of your expenses. Now, obviously this is a college worksheet because you adults, some of you guys have a lot more expenses than this. But here's what I want you to do. The date that you spend it, the description of what you bought, and the amount it costs. Now, let me go over that again because that's super difficult. You're like, oh, what's the first column? Okay. Well, let's start here. What you bought, when you bought it, and how much it cost. What you bought, when you bought it, and how much it cost. Let me just give you a little heads up, students. Let me just get your attention because you left about when I pulled the spreadsheet out. So let me just get your attention back. If you ever want more money from your parents, let me just tell you, if you do this, and you go to your dad, you go to your mom, or you go to your dad and say, Dad, I need more money. But before I tell you how much, before I tell you, before I say anything else, Dad, let me just sit down with you. Come on, Dad, let me show you this sheet that I got. Dad, let me pull up this Excel spreadsheet. God, Dad, not God, Dad. Sometimes he feels like God. He's like, no, you shall not get more money. Anyways, Dad, come on, Dad, let me show you this Quicken worksheet that I've got spread. I know that's a stretch, I know for many of you, But he's saying, come on, all right, let me show you what I bought, when I bought it, and how much I spent. Dad, I have it broken down into categories. You can see, this is how much I spent on eating out. This is how much I spent on, hair care products. Let's go with that one, the first one that came to mind, Got Dad, this is how much I spent on everything. This is when I bought it, and this is how much I cost. And Dad, I know maybe I misspent some of it, but here's what I'm going to do next time. Let me just tell you, your dad, your mom will be like, oh my gosh, my baby is responsible. Are you kidding? They'll be like, I'm saying, if you want to pick your parents to know Jesus, like show them an Excel sheet that says, and say, I learned it at church. Your parents are going to say, I want to go to that church. Keep going to that church. Go, absolutely. But let me just tell you why. Let me tell you why your parents are apprehensive to give you more money. Because they don't know where it went, and neither do you. How in the world do you expect your parents to give you more money if they don't know where it went and you don't know where it went, but you just feel like you need more because you don't have enough? You don't know how you're going to change. You don't know how you're going to fix. You don't know how you're going to adjust, but you need more. And thousands of rich people pray to God every single day. I need more. I need more. God, I can't pay my bills. God, I can't pay this. God, I can't pay that. And we have plenty of money. And we pray, Heavenly Father, I need more. But if we don't even know where what God has given us is going, if we're not even responsible enough with the things that God has given us now, how in the world, why in the world would it make sense for God to say, here you go. Here's all the money. Here's the raise. The Bible kind of says it this way. Be diligent in the small things. Be diligent in the small things. And let me just tell you, for primarily the young audience, this is why this is critical. If you can't be generous when you're making $400 a month, there's no way you're going to be generous when you make $40,000 a year. If you can't be generous when you make $800 a month, there's no way you're going to be generous when you make $80,000 a year. Again, study after study shows that the more you make, percentage-wise, the less you give. The more you make, percentage-wise, the less generous you are with what you have. You might give dollar-wise more, but percentage-wise, we get stingier and stingier and stingier. So let me just tell you, this is homework. If you'll take and you'll start to track your expenses and you'll just set goals. I mean, there's a ton of other stuff that you can do. But if you will just begin to do that, you will start to think of your money as something you are responsible for and not something that you own. You'll have more in savings, you'll have less in debt, and you'll know where what you had went. Because how in the world, if I'm trusting you with my money, if I went back to my financial advisors and I said, so where's my money? And they said, Ben, it's all gone, but we need more. I said, well, where'd it go? We ate out, I know. There was an away game that we went to. You know, we played Clemson and we kind of had to go. We were smart. We slept on a couch. I mean, it's not a big deal. We spent $1 bajillion on gas, but we slept on a couch, so it's not a big deal. I'd say, you kidding me? I'm going to fire you. Not that God's going to, fire you, excommunicate you from heaven, but I mean, come on. If we're not responsible with what God's given us, if we're not stewarding what God's given us, if we're not managing what God's given us, how in the world can we expect God to continually give if we're not diligent and responsible with what He's already given? Now let me just tell you, I'll end with this. This is why this matters. Because at the end of the day, our finances are a reflection of our stewardship of the things of the kingdom of God. That is to say, God, beyond any measure of money, is the founder of generosity. When He saw a lost and a hurting and a broken world and gave His one and only Son for a bunch of people who didn't deserve it and who turned their back on Him. And He said, before I ask you to be generous, before I ask you to steward, before I ask you to manage, I'm going to give you something that you could never repay. And I'm going to give you my Son. And in fact, I'm going to give you, beyond that, the ministry of letting the entire world know about Him. Paul would later again go on and say that he has given us this ministry of reconciliation, of how this perfect God, this holy God, this pure God made this impure, imperfect, sinful people right with Him. That God was making His plea through us be reconciled to Him, and He has entrusted us, He has gifted us, He has given us the stewardship and the management of the ministry of His Son. And so we thought, what better way to end this service? That we're going to take communion together. Because we want you to walk out. And we want you to feel so rich. We don't want you to necessarily feel rich that, we're just going to give away hundreds as you walk up here and we're going to dip the 100. That's nothing like that. But we want you to feel so rich. That God so richly gave His Son for you and for me. That while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. And He has given us the responsibility, the management of the ministry of His Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. He said, you're rich. You're rich. You're rich. And you don't have to feel bad. You don't have to feel bad about how much I've richly given you and my son. But I want you to feel responsible with this message of taking it to the world. So when we're going to take communion, we don't do it necessarily by rows, just kind of get up as you want to. Take a piece of the bread, tear it off, dip it in the cup, and we just want you to know, you're rich. You're rich. You have a God who has given you more than you could ever pay back when he gave you his son. And he's given us the ability, he's given us the responsibility to steward that. So we want you to take this home. We want you to set goals. We want you to do all those things. But more than that, we want you to feel richly loved by a God who so richly gave his son. So let's pray together.